Welcome and thanks for joining us for our Workday Chats today. I'm Rosie Coffrey and I'm your host for today's discussion. If you have any questions, please share them in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Today, we've invited guest workmates to join me from both our Talented 10th and Pride Employee Belonging Councils. Our guests will share their personal stories as well as provide a personal perspective on what's happening socially right now within their communities. Let's start with introductions of today's guests. Jacqueline, would you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Brown, and I am a member of the Talented 10th Employee Belonging Council. I'm a co-founder and currently the chapter lead of our Pleasanton chapter.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Hi, Rosie. Hi, Jacqueline. My name is Enda McKenna. I've been with Workday for 3.5 years. I work in our corporate development department out of our Dublin office in Ireland. And I'm the co-liaison for our Pride Employee Belonging Council, or EBC, as we call them. You might know them as an employee resource group or an ERG, but the Pride EBC.
Wonderful. In today's discussion, we will focus on making sense of the landscape, both within the Black and the LGBTQ communities, and how to best navigate those conversations. So I'd like to ask both of you, as you make sense of the landscape within your community, what has been your personal journey?
Thanks, Rosie, for asking that question. I'll start. Just to give you a little history about myself, I grew up in Washington, D.C., in the urban part of Washington, D.C., and I am the oldest daughter of 7 children raised by a single mom. And in the environment that I grew up in, it was a predominantly Black environment. And my experience in my community was one of a lot of internalized colorism and racism. And for those of you not familiar with that term, basically what it means is that within your community, you're judged by the color of your skin, whether your skin is lighter or darker. And because my skin was lighter, the girls that I went to school with in my community, they harassed me and they bullied me, and they basically made me feel like I was not part of that community. And so I struggled a lot in that community. It wasn't until I actually went to high school, and I went to high school in Maryland, which was more predominantly white, that I felt more accepted, which is so odd that you would feel more accepted outside of your community than within your community. And so it actually took me a long time to relate to my community from that perspective, because all of my interactions within my own community were painful. And so I had to really sort of recheck myself as I grew older and I started working in the work world and really starting to appreciate my culture and my community. I never devalued that I was Black or where I had grown up. What I devalued is how I was treated where I grew up.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jacqueline. I know that on a personal level, having been brought up and raised, born in the U.S., also 7 children. My parents are from Mexico. And even within our community, the Latinx community, I struggled with that because I was born and raised here. So I don't know if many of you have heard the term, but I was called a coconut, brown on the outside and white on the inside. And that was pretty harsh, and I didn't really know what that meant for me. And have you experienced anything similar to what Jacqueline and I have just shared?
I would say yes, and it's only when you start to open up and realize that it's not just internalized homophobia within the LGBT community, it's all minorities and marginalized groups have that as well within their communities. I mean, I grew up in rural, conservative, Catholic Ireland, and it wasn't easy, growing up and being name called and that bullying at school that you mentioned, Rosie. That's very real for me, and Jacqueline, as you alluded to, struggling to identify with the community that I was part of. And it's a process, it's a journey. I'm on that journey, not quite there. I don't know where the destination is, but I've come a long way from struggling with who I am to the point now that I'm actually able to support different people within the community who I don't know, who I can't relate to, who I don't have the same experiences with. I can't say that my experience and my journey is the same as a lesbian in the UK or a transgender person in the US. So within the community, we're so different and all have different experiences and different journeys.
Well, was there a moment, Enda, that you would say during that journey that, you know, you had this realization? There was a moment where something happened as you were evolving through and going on the journey to where you are now that was kind of impactful for you?
I mean, there are plenty, and my journey is probably very different to everyone else's, as I mentioned, and I don't represent or speak for on behalf of the entire community. I can only tell the story from my point of view. I mean, school was tough. School is tough for most young people. I was called queer before I even knew what that was. So it was as if the kids that were calling me this knew that I was gay before I knew. And that word has always haunted me and stuck with me. And I know now that the community have reclaimed that word so that you're part of a queer community. It's very different, and context is everything. But that bullying still exists. That internalized homophobia exists. We live in a very heteronormative world where everything we see from magazines, from media, from TV, the norm is man, woman, kids. And we're not exposed to it, not just in Ireland, but around the world. And that is part of the reason why the LGBT youth have the highest suicide rate in the world. We are on a journey. We're getting places, and my fear is that we go back, and we're starting to see that in some countries, in some respects, in some organizations, and even within our own community. It's trying to battle that and fight that. And we need to tell our community that LGBT lives matter in the same way that Black lives matter. And those are very important messages, that the fight for equality is intersectional. It's not one or the other. Equal rights and equality, it's not like pizza or a pie. Just by giving some to minorities and underrepresented communities, you're not taking away rights from other people. There's enough for everyone. It's equal rights for all. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily an aha moment, but there are certain things that I look at or that I read about, and I look at people's struggle with gender identity or orientation identity, that I want to support, that I want to help in any way that I can. So activism is really important to me.
Yeah, I think both of you really hit on the topic around the fact that there's a lot of similarity within the communities, just the self-acceptance within your own communities, and wanting to invite others into your community can be a bit challenging when you've gone down your own journey of trying to figure out where you fit into your own community. As you've gone down this journey and you are where you are now, my question is, how have the conversations maybe shifted with these recent events around racial tensions? How do you think that the Pride Month has elevated those conversations in conjunction with Juneteenth? How does, as you said, into the intersectionality, how does that come into conversation as we're seeing this shift around us in these events?
What I would say is that what I've noticed is that these are minority communities that are coming together. I mean, we look at 1916 and the Stonewall Uprising. Marsha P. Johnson was a Black trans woman, a drag queen. And again, self-ID is another topic. But regardless of how Marsha self-ID'd, she was an outspoken advocate for LGBT rights. And that's what we're looking at right now within other minority communities. And we need change. Our community has been fighting and asking and telling and looking and demanding for change for a very, very long time. And it has to happen. It has to come. By minorities coming together, they can become the majority and advocate for change. I'm hoping that we're moving in the right direction, that we will see light at the end of the tunnel. And it goes back to the point that I was making earlier on. Rights for everyone is not less rights for the majority.
Yeah.
Jacqueline, give me your thoughts around these racial and inequality tensions that we're seeing around the globe.
Yeah, you know, it's something that's been around for so long, and it's frustrating that, you know, 400 years of this oppression still continues in the world today. When you think about how technology has changed over 400 years, why is it that we are still dealing with the same issues that our ancestors were dealing with long ago? When I was reading I was reading the essay from W.E.B. Du Bois on the talented 10th, and he was advocating for the education of Black people. That article was written in 1903. It's 117 years ago. And it basically said that we just need to educate our people, and by doing so, they will lead us and lead others to better themselves. And that's the summation of it. But it just seems to me that what we're dealing with right now are the same things that we dealt with back then. And what we are seeing now is just the tipping point of frustration, where people are just fed up, they are tired. And that was the outcome of the recent events, and the violence and the destruction that went along with it was a part of that. And while I absolutely don't condone the violence and the destruction that went on of people's personal properties and the impact that had on people's livelihood, it was sending a message that we're just tired and change needs to happen now, not a year from now, not 5 years from now, today. And I think that's what Juneteenth is representing. Juneteenth is now saying, we realized this freedom several 100 years ago, but we really haven't been free. And now it's time to really be free. It's time for the justice to take place. It's time for us to recognize that there are all these different things that we need to do in order to make that happen. I was listening to the news today when they were talking about Quaker Oats is now doing away with their Aunt Jemima brand and their Uncle Ben brand because it's racist, right? And so companies are now taking a stand. Individuals are pushing back, saying this has to change. And so I think that what Juneteenth is going to represent is not only the freedom that it represented all of those years ago, but really there's a freedom that we need to have and we need to exercise today. And this should be the beginning of that journey to real change.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's important for people to understand that Juneteenth has, its origins in the Black community, but it's so representative across the entire globe, right? That injustice, that inequality, that it's time, as Enda has brought up as well, that all communities should, have that equality and equity that is fair for everyone. And you brought up something else, Jacqueline, I thought was very interesting, is it's time for change. This is not the first time we've said it. It's not the first time it's happened, but there's something very unique and different in the atmosphere. And I think really what I'm hopeful of is that 6 months from now, we're still going to be on this road of change. A year from now, we're still going to be on this road of change, and it's not going to quiet down. Even if protests go away, it's not going to quiet down, and we can continue to see that momentum. So that's my hope. Let's see if that happens. But let me take a minute and switch gears on our discussion. I'd like to talk a little bit more about organizations and how they can foster these safe and brave spaces. As you know, safe space is an environment free of bias, criticism, judgment, and threat. But it's even more critical now that companies start to foster a brave space. That's where we can have those safe, open, honest, professional dialogue in a way where individuals' perspectives and thoughts can be discussed and heard, especially when the conversation is difficult, it's challenging. People would rather turn around and go in the other direction and not have the discussion. It's really important that we start to foster that. So I'd like to get your thoughts around how can an organization support employees in enabling the right conversations, and what might be some of those challenges that employees or an organization might face in trying to create that more inclusive, safe, and brave space. Jacqueline, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Sure. Part of what I think is very powerful is the community of employee belonging councils within the organizations. They really have the power, one, to bring together a community of people, and to bring together community, and by community I say bring together that community of like people that can come together, but also to bring together the allies for those communities as well. And so starting there, I feel like a lot of the employee belonging councils that are part of these organizations are viewed as some kind of separate community or separate association, which the executive leaders don't tap into. And by not doing that, they do themselves a disservice, because there are things happening within those communities that they need to be aware of. There's also, within those EBCs, there are conversations that are being had that need to be had at a much larger scale. And so again, the leaders of those organizations need to ensure that they are fostering that conversation across their organizations. They need to be visible. They need to participate in those conversations. They need to participate in the sessions that are happening, and they need to let those communities know that they are in support of them, because in most times they've funded them, they've created a budget for them. But outside of that, they're absent from real activity or real involvement in those communities. And so I feel like in order for there to be a real change happening within organizations, tap into those employee belonging councils, advocate for them, spread that across the organizations, and really take an active participation in being able to do so.
That's great insight. Anda, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree. I think visibility is absolutely key. When I look at management at various levels throughout any organization, I want to see myself represented there. And it's the same for anyone. Representation and visibility is key. Right now, we're starting to have conversations and open up some dialogue that's uncomfortable for many people who have sat on the sidelines, been silent for a very long time, and always said that they weren't racist. But now it's the time to come up and actually be anti-racist. And that's the message that we're hearing from lots of different places, be it political or media or whatever the case is. And it's the same within our organizations. We have to be uncomfortable if we want anything to change. I can think of a couple of examples of times that I felt that, oh, I really should have addressed that, or I shouldn't allow things that maybe make me feel uncomfortable to just go by without saying something. I had a conversation with a coworker fairly recently about what I was up to for the weekend, and sort of asked, did I live with my girlfriend? Was I going out the weekend with my girlfriend? And it was just a very simple assumption. And just by changing the language and the narrative on that, you can ask the question in a very different way without necessarily probing. Now, I didn't correct my colleague. I thought about it afterwards, and it didn't hurt me. Why would it hurt me? But it was afterwards that I felt hurt that I didn't correct that individual. Was that because I'm ashamed? Because I'm embarrassed? Because I think it will have a negative impact on how I'm perceived? So I just gave a simple no and moved along with the conversation. And it's moments like that, not in the moment, but afterwards, that I lie in bed at night and think about how and why did I do that? So I think being uncomfortable and picking and choosing your battles, that's a very simple one. But there are other examples of times that oppressed minority groups feel that it's just easier to blend into the background or better to say nothing. They don't want to be the loud one or the person that's causing the problems or the trouble or be perceived in that way. So it is just easier to say nothing. Whereas now we are talking about being uncomfortable. And I think that's a good thing. It's a good starting point.
Mm-hmm. And I just would add also one other thing, as the importance of having these conversations is, I mean, you can't devalue that. I think what's important to understand about these conversations is that if you're going to have them, the people that are involved in those conversations need to be prepared for opposing views. They need to be prepared to listen to different perspectives. Because here's a really good example. You know, we all know that we've heard that you're not supposed to talk about politics in the office. But if the three of us are talking about politics and we are on we think the same way about the politics or the particular leader that is leading the country, we all agree on that, the conversation is fine. But the minute someone comes in with an opposing opinion, or let's say they don't or did not vote for the particular leader that's in office, and they have a different opinion, then the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Why is that? They're entitled to their opinion just as you are entitled to yours. And so as we start having these conversations, we need to be prepared for not everybody is going to have the same opinion you have. Most people are going to have different perspectives about just about whatever you're talking about. But the purpose of the conversation is to be open to listen to someone else's perspective. I cannot represent all of the Black community because I don't know all of the experiences of the Black community. I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. I don't know what it's like to be a dark complected woman. I know what my experience is, but what I do know is having had conversations that are open, and I'm open to listen to perspectives, I now can understand the perspective of a dark-skinned woman or a Black man. And what I have realized in that conversation, the commonality of racism is we all have experienced that. That's the common theme. But we have to be prepared to be open when we are entering in these conversations. Otherwise, that uncomfortability will actually shy us away from having those types of conversations.
I agree. And I think at this point in time, we've got 5 generations in the workplace. Never in the history of time has the workplace been so diverse. And as we struggle to identify within our own communities, we look at the employee resource groups and the EBCs that we have. And it's not just people who are part of the community. It's in the LGBT space. It's the parents, it's the grandparents of LGBT people. And that's really important as well, because they know, just like my parents were when I came out to them, they were afraid, they were concerned, they were worried about what my career would be like, what my finances would be like, what my prospects and how I would be treated in the workplace. And these are inclusive spaces. These are the brave spaces that we talk about that are absolutely key for organizations and for people to feel that sense of belonging to the brand or the company that they work at.
Yeah. Those are great perspectives. I want to take that conversation to that next level. You both touched on it just a little bit. Is, you know, although we are part of a company or part of an organization, we also have this opportunity on a very personal level to take action, to do something. As you said, Jacqueline, you know, when those conversations are difficult, you know, do we just walk away? You know, do we avoid them? How do we absorb the differences in opinion? You know, and you talked about, you know, sometimes it's just not worth it. How do you make those decisions? But even more important, how do you convey that to someone else? If we want to create those brave spaces, what can each and every one of us do on a very personal level to start to get this change happening, get this momentum happening, make sure that it doesn't end 6 months or a year from now? How do we take personal responsibility for that change? What are your thoughts around that? Either of you.
Well, my first thought is I had 2 things. One, educate yourself. Educate yourself on not only what's happening today, but historically what has happened. Because if you're going to have a conversation with someone, you want to be as informed as you possibly can, but also be ready to learn something new. So, but do some homework, be educated, get some education. Also, get involved in your local communities to the extent that you feel like you can make an impact, whatever you feel like that is. That's a very important thing. And then the simple thing of talking to your colleague, talking to your neighbor, talking to your children, have conversations, because again, those are things important. Children are actually experiencing things in school around racism and bullying and discrimination every single day. And it is important to have these types of conversations with your children, with your family. And I read an article where they actually outline some key questions that you can ask a colleague, because you don't want to be offensive and you don't want to sound like you're prying, but you just want to get to understand from their perspective. So there's a way to ask certain questions of people so that you can have a conversation as opposed to it seeming like you're prying into their personal lives. So those are the things that I think that you can do: educate, have conversations, and get involved.
Wonderful. Enda, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I think although there's definitely some common ground and commonalities between the LGBT Pride movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, they're very, very distinct groups, and of course intersectionality is in the middle. But visibility is key. I mean, I can turn on and off my persona, my personality as I need. I'm constantly assessing my risk. If I'm out and about, is it safe to hold my partner's hand? Not me personally, but I know the community at large. And in this heteronormative world, it can be difficult. And even if you do hold your partner's hand for a second, you're constantly scanning the pavement ahead and assessing the risk. Are there a group of drunks ahead? Is my life in danger? Do I feel threatened? And then it's quickly pull your hand aside. We look at opposite sex couples where they're snuggling up and hands in each other's pockets, and that's exactly what we want. It's not necessarily a big ask, but that visibility piece is so important. If you do have an employee belonging council that represents Pride, you can get involved in that, even if it is as simple as hanging up posters at your location, at your site, or wearing your t-shirt on certain days so that there's a bit of visibility. If you do march in Pride Parade, fantastic. What I would say to hiring managers, look at your team. What does it represent? How diverse actually is it? As Jacqueline said, support those charities and nonprofits, get into activism work and see how you can help the community beyond just the four walls that you work in. And then to leaders within business, I would say look at your policy, look at your facilities. What can you do to help the community at large, be it gender neutral bathrooms or healthcare provisions for the trans community, so that protections are in place as they transition in the workplace. These are things that can be done: visibility, outreach, and policies and facilities.
Yeah, that's great insight from both of you. And definitely I'm a strong proponent that at an individual level, at whatever level you're at, individual contributor, manager, frontline manager, senior director, or leader in your company, you have a sense of responsibility at a personal level. It's no longer okay to say I didn't know, I wasn't aware, I don't know what to do, because as both of you have called out, you can start out with one thing: get educated, and then engage at the level that feels best for you, that's most comfortable for you. And so I completely agree with you. So I want to take a second just to say thank you to both of you for your time, for opening up, for being willing to share your stories and your passion around this topic. I really greatly appreciate it. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and I invite everyone to join us for the next hashtag wdaychats. Thank you.
Thank you both.